Okay, hello everybody. Gabriela, am I okay to go? Okay.
Yes.
Good evening to everybody connected from Barcelona. Good morning or everything in between to all of you connected from different parts of the world. Welcome to the Institute for Advanced Architecture lecture series. Today we launch our lecture series with an opening lecture by Sanjay Sarma, at a very peculiar moment for the world, with all communities, including the academic ones, affected in ways that we have never seen before. We decided to launch our academic year, not with an expert talk in architecture, in design, or in urban planning. We decided to launch this year's lecture series with a talk about the future of education, the future of learning, its power, its principles, as well as its limitations and its risks. So there is no doubt that education is key when we seek from our discipline and when we seek from our society to define and implement better futures, innovative, more sustainable, resilient, equal, or more democratically accessible futures. And at the same time, there is no doubt that the way we teach and learn is radically changing. Content is changing, format and modes of delivery are changing as well. The information society potential, coupled with the unforeseen challenges we're facing today, including, of course, the pandemics, they affect education. So how can we harvest the potential of learning? How can we evolve traditional ways of education? What can we learn from the present challenges? And how can we transform students to change makers, as we usually call our student community here in Barcelona? Because for us at IAAC, experimenting new ways of learning is fundamental for bringing a change in the business as usual. Learn out of making, learning by living, distributed education, or ways of teaching how to learn instead of what to learn are some of the principles that we follow in our educational programs. So we are therefore more than happy to host today together with us Sanjay Sarma, an expert on education and learning, but not only. Sarma, allow me to introduce him with some words. Sanjay Sarma is Professor of Mechanical Engineering at the MIT, and he's also the Vice President for Open Learning in Cambridge. In all his endeavors, Professor Sarma has been at the forefront of technologies now known as the Internet of Things and used worldwide. These include computational geometry, sensing, RFID, automation, and CAD. So Sanjay is a mechanical engineer, but at the same time, he's an entrepreneur himself, and he also advises several national governments and global companies. Though today, I think he will be wearing another hat, this of expert in education and learning, because apart from being Vice President of Open Learning at the MIT, he also leads different groups, including MITx, that delivers revolutionary massive open online courses to millions of students around the world straight from the cloud. So he has different ways of understanding how learning can be delivered. Sanjay Sarma will be talking today about the science and practice of learning, about how we learn, how we teach, a bit about the history of education and learning, and of course, how we need to change in the face of new challenges such as COVID-19, and in the face of new digital technologies that enable, for instance, online learning. So Sanjay, thank you very much for joining us today from Boston. It's great to see the MIT on your background. Thank you for delivering our IAAC opening lecture, and everybody just help me with a digital clap to welcome Sanjay Sarma lecturing on the future of learning. Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you very much, Arati, and a pleasure to speak to you all. Barcelona is one of my favorite cities, so it's great to also speak to people, some of whom are in Barcelona. I know not many, not all. Just to be clear, can you see my deck? Arati, it says future of learning. Great.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Thank you. So, all right. So let me kick it off with a couple of pictures. You know, our educational system that we are all used to today was not defined by some Holy Spirit. It was defined by human beings. It's not defined by evolution. And if you look at the history of our education system today, it actually has two roots. The earliest educational institution of higher ed was actually in what is now Pakistan. It is a place called Takshila, which started off as a Hindu monastery and then a Buddhist monastery in 500, maybe 600 BC. And then those monasteries, and then in China, they had several education institutions, but then they faded away. And then in the late part of the first millennium, we started seeing monasteries in every religion, actually, again. And so really, so there are two threads that come together to define what our educational system is today. So the first is the monastic tradition. So today, if you go to a monastery, a Buddhist monastery, a Christian monastery, you'll see the roots of the modern education system. And the picture on the right below is this guy, if you can see my mouse, is from Bologna. This is from 750 or so years ago. And if you look at it, it looks really familiar, right? It looks exactly like a lecture today, right? Except they have beards. You know, this gentleman is lecturing. This student is taking a nap, right? Those two are talking to each other. This guy is distracted by his iPhone. It's the same thing. Nothing has changed, really. That's 700 years. And so from an architectural perspective, I'm not an architect, but I will say this. There are implications because monasteries were closed. In fact, we have a word for it, cloister, right? You go in and then you study. And you studied the holy book, you know, whichever the book was, or you studied wisdom as it was then. In fact, a lot of our modern wisdom comes from religious wisdom. So I'm not one who's contemptuous of it. I respect it. But that's really the first root. And that's where a lot of our education systems come. Actually, the modern Western education systems owe a lot to Islamic traditions, going back to Al-Qayyim, which is in Morocco, which along with the Azhar, etc., you know, are about more than 1,000 years old. In fact, our concept of the degree comes from the Arabic word izazas, which means the right. It's a sort of a permission that you give to another scholar to teach the book. And so that's where the education institution comes from. So that's the first root. But then a second thing happened, and this happened in the second half of this millennium. And it's the big picture to the right. What happened was that the Industrial Revolution started occurring. There are many stories behind it. I'll simplify it. Of course, you had to train people to work in factories. That's sort of the commonly told story. The less known story is that you had parents who are working and you wanted to do something with their kids. So it's almost like childcare. You might as well teach them stuff. And there's also the other history. And so what they did was in Europe was sit these kids down and put them through a factory model of education is the common way to say it. And that is the second stream that came together with the monastic tradition, and it defines our modern educational system today. And there are also some cartoons about it, like the one below on the left, which shows students coming in, and we take out all discipline, creativity, and intelligence, and we pump them out. Okay, that's a little bit harsh, but nonetheless, that is one issue. And really, it comes down to actually the cartoon on above, which is what do factories make? They make products. If you look at products, what do you have to do with products? You have to test them to ensure there's quality. So in fact, our educational system became very systematized, and product testing became the defining characteristic. And so today we have an education system that is highly regimented and based on testing. And that's where we find ourselves in the 21st century. And this was been happening for over 1,000 years. And if you talk to education people in the education industry, it's very difficult to change things. There's regulations. Teachers are actually the heroes in this. We don't celebrate them enough. My mother was a teacher. Teachers try their best to make, because they are the people on the ground dealing with young minds and seeing the potential. But the systems are so regulated that it's very hard to change. And that's where we are. So I'll come back to this. I'll refer to this later. But I made this presentation, or I could have given this presentation in January or February before COVID struck. Okay, so my next slide is also pre-COVID, and then I'll explain how COVID impacts us, because COVID changes everything even more. It was changing anyway, it needed to change anyway, but COVID changes things even more. So if you look at the rate of adoption of new technologies going back 100 years, you see that technologies like the telephone took a long time to be adopted. And then if you move into the 30s and 40s, things got adopted a little bit more rapidly. So for example, cars got adopted, quite fast, color TV even faster. By the 2010s, all the graphs, all the lines are basically vertical. The reason for that is that suddenly now we have become technology hungry, and because of the pace of innovation and because of the competition, people are adopting things really fast. The smartphone is only 12 years old, 13 years old. And you see everyone has one across the planet. Even very poor people have smartphones because it's a tool for existence almost. What does that mean? That means that's good because technologies are getting adopted, practices are getting adopted. It also means that one of the assumptions of our model of education is fundamentally flawed. Many assumptions, but one particularly. And that is somehow that you can educate someone for 4 years or 3 years, bachelor's degree, and release them into the world and they're ready for life. Just imagine if I said to you, all you have to do is go to the gym for 3 years of your life and you'll be fit for the rest of your life. Obviously, you would laugh at it. And the reason is because you lose your fitness. But the same thing actually applies to our learning, because you lose your learning. It's not that you lose your learning, it's that the world has changed. It's almost as if you're standing on a treadmill that is going backwards. And if you're not jogging forward, you're going to fall off the edge. And every year, the treadmill is going faster. And that's what this graph shows. In addition to all that, more and more people are working for themselves. So this is a graph from The Economist showing more and more people are self-employed. And it's also called the gig economy, and we're studying all this right now and trying to figure out what it means. But I tell you what, after COVID, companies aren't going to expand. They certainly aren't going to expand, except for a few, like Zoom is going to expand, maybe, right? But most companies are going to be not hiring a lot of people. And a lot of folks will end up being freelancers. They'll work for themselves. They will be e-lancers, that's the other word for it, electronic freelancers on sites like Upwork, coders, accountants, lawyers, right? Now, what that means is we developed an education system from the monastic tradition, from the factory tradition, to prepare people for a life when the book or the technology remained the same, and where they worked for someone else mostly. We are now in a world where every human being has to become the chief executive officer, the CEO of their own life, and the chief learning officer of their own life, and the chief technology officer of their own life, and the chief marketing officer of their own life. And the question really is, Is our education system prepared for this? Do we confer on our students agency? Do we give them the self-efficacy to go out and eat what they hunt? Because this is the world we're entering. And then in 2013, COVID struck. I'm sorry, 2020, COVID struck, 2019 and 2020. And we are seeing a massive transformation of industries. Some industries will be positively impacted. Digital companies, online commerce, obviously, telecoms. We're all surviving. Look at this. We're all on telecom right now, right? Healthcare has gone online. So online healthcare is booming. Not all of healthcare, but online healthcare. But with COVID, people are paying more attention to healthcare, biotech, et cetera, et cetera. Shared office space is winning. Why? Because if you work from home, why would you keep your lease on your office space? You'd rather just go into a shared office space. So that's going to win. Local supply chains, we're dependent on a global supply chain, which broke down. How many of you could get masks in Barcelona in March? You couldn't. How many doctors and nurses could get personal protective equipment? They couldn't. So that's what's going to change. But look at the industries that are going to be impacted. Retail, commercial real estate, airlines, hotels, restaurants. What do I mean by hub cities? This has implications for architects. Today or before COVID, everyone had to be in Palo Alto or in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Austin, Texas, or in an expensive part of Barcelona or Haifa or Shanghai or Bangalore to be close to work. Now we're all working remotely using Zoom, which is on the left. That means that commercial real estate will go down. Real estate might go down in these big cities. But if people become used to working remotely, why pay that incredible rent? So it is called the breakdown of the super zip. That's going to happen. And of course, internationalism is going to take a backseat. Already travel restrictions, but you also see massive international trade wars and things like that happening. And there's going to be a massive job shift. It's like a migration. It's an intellectual migration. Okay, we've all seen the tragic pictures of people trying to sail across in little boats across the Mediterranean, or huddled masses, walking through foreign countries to get to some other place, from Syria, from Venezuela, from Africa. We are all going to be migrants very soon, except we'll be intellectual migrants. And the boat that takes us across is education. This year, in March, in April, according to UNESCO, there were 1.6 billion students separated from their educational institutions. 1.6 billion. And it's not the old education. This is a new type of education based on knowledge, not on exams, not on tests. Because in the gig economy, you work for yourself. If you have a degree from MIT, it helps you in your first job. But your second job depends on the ratings you got from your first job. Doesn't matter whether you're from MIT or not. Did you do a good job? And so true learning becomes more important, profoundly important. The challenge, though, is our education is like medicine in the 1900s. It's based on a somewhat primitive understanding of the body. Now, medicine in the 1900s, what could you do if someone was sick? You don't have antibiotics, you don't have genetics, you don't have x-rays, you didn't understand neuroscience, you didn't understand biochemistry. Look what's happening with COVID today. Immediately, we sequenced the genes of SARS-CoV-2. We created tests, not very well, but we did it within a year. Vaccines are happening, right? That's because we understand the intrinsics of biology. In education, most of our systems that we're so loyal to were established without understanding how the brain works. And it's only in the last 100 years, and the last 50 years, and the last 20 years, and the last 10 years, and the last 5 years that we have figured out how the brain works and how learning works. So I'm going to talk about that next. I'm not going to quiz you on this, don't worry. It's just a picture. We now understand the beginnings of how the brain works. We understand how we form memories. We sort of understand how we form memories. We're beginning to understand where empathy and insight happen. Emotions. We understand how fear and, happiness happen. It's called the limbic system, the reward system. We understand intuition. We begin to understand things now, finally. By the way, I should tell you that the red piece in the front of your head, right? We always point to it, right? I'm thinking, and you point there. My head is hurting, you point there. That is a part of the brain that the human being has that apes don't. That is the CEO of your brain. It's called the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex. We understand this now. Based on this understanding, should not our education change? Will it? So let's talk about that. By the way, how do we understand all this? We understand it because of breakthroughs in technology, in biology. Ramon y Cajal, the Spaniard, there's a street named after him in Madrid, got the Nobel Prize for drawing neurons and figuring out what neurons were. And even this technology called functional MRI, with which we can figure out which part of a musician's brain lights up when they play music, for example, or where we process hearing and why someone with dyslexia has issues. All these things come from extraordinary breakthroughs in technology. And I'm just going to give you a quick summary of one of those technologies. And that is something called functional MRI. It's actually just MRI, but the story is a beautiful one. It turns out that when one portion of your brain is active, that portion of the brain will absorb more oxygen. It makes sense. It's like your computer, right? If the graphics processor is more active, that chip heats up because it needs more energy. So it's the same thing. And so all these incredible people, Mossy, Roy, Sherrington, Pauling, Linus Pauling, Coriel, all these people figured this out one after another, building on each other. And one of them figured out that Pauling and Coriel figured out that oxygen-rich hemoglobin is repelled by a magnetic field. Oxygen-depleted hemoglobin is attracted by a magnetic field. And then Seiji, and such an international group, Seiji Ogawa, a Japanese gentleman, realized that you could abuse or take advantage of an MRI machine to do this. And Bellevue and Kwong first applied it first to mice and then to human beings. And now we can figure out which part of the brain does what. It's not the whole story, but we're figuring this out. Right? So it's fascinating. And then this is just one technology. There's diffusion tensor imaging. There's optogenetics. I won't bore you with all of them, but we are finally beginning to understand how the brain works. Just like 15 years ago, we figured out how genetics work. I'm going to come back to this picture from Bologna. This format of lectures is very, very resilient. Why is it? The reason it is so resilient is because it's actually based on a convenient misunderstanding of education, which we need to shake off. We need to shake these shackles off. We need to have the courage and the commitment to shake it off. Here's the misunderstanding. The misunderstanding is that the professor has a pen and the student's brain is a sheet of paper. And all the professor has to do is write on that sheet of paper. It takes agency away from the student. If the student doesn't pay attention, you can yell at them. You can shake a finger and say, you're not paying attention. Because, damn it, the professor has the pen and the student is a passive recipient of knowledge. This turns out to be fundamentally flawed. The reality is actually, that the student is creating a model of the world. It's like a plant growing. And when that plant needs oxygen, when it needs sunlight, when it needs nitrogen, potassium, water, you give it when it wants, not when you want. You can't give a plant all the water it needs in its life on day one and assume that somehow it'll be fine. But that's really the model that the factory approach has forced us into. There's a great quote from Plutarch, who our host, Arati, know the history of. He said, so this is the assumption that the mind is a sheet of paper and the professor writes on it. The quote is, in fact, what he said is, the mind is not a vessel to be filled. The mind is a fire to be kindled. And this is where our education system screws up, because we see it as a vessel to be killed. And you know why we do that? Because it's so convenient and it fits our model of the factory. And it is inhuman. If you really want to understand how learning works, I have an analogy here. It's a little bit silly, but it's correct actually. So let me walk you through the analogy of how learning actually works. So the way learning works is, what you have are little nuggets of knowledge that come in, every day I learn something, you learn something. And what you want is an organized mind where all the knowledge is sorted and stored away so you can repeat it. You can pull it out. You can use it. As architects, maybe you're designing something and you remember something and you connect the dots and use it to architect something, you design something new. Remember I pointed at the CEO of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex. That's the forehead. I pointed at it, the red piece in the brain. That guy, I'm going to show as a leprechaun, just because leprechauns are sort of cool. So that guy, what he does is he runs down and he picks up these little nuggets of information. And then he has to figure out how to fit it into the knowledge, the library of knowledge that he's putting together. So he has to sort of melt it and shape it and beat it into shape and make sure it fits like a jigsaw puzzle. And then he puts it away in the treasury, right? And for those of us from South Asia, that would be the khajana, right? Puts it away. Now, that guy is the CEO of the brain, the executive function, the prefrontal cortex. In this act is called consolidation, integration, sense-making, saliency. And here's the crazy thing. After 10 minutes of learning, most students, including you, and I'm abusing this right now because we're so stuck in this approach, need to make sense of everything that was said, and you will be distracted. The brain is designed to be distracted after 10 minutes because you have to connect the dots and you have to do this stuff. What do most teachers do? They plow on. Now, I'm not giving a lecture in the sense of an academic lecture. I'm trying to make a bigger, deeper point. So I'm going to try and get away with it. But really what I should do now is stop and ask you if you have any questions, because I need to give you a break to sense make. So just this once, I want to try it. Any questions? Anyone?
Yes.
Go ahead, Mario.
So how can we overlap, or how can we overcome the loop of actually not knowing a subject and having to go to someone that knows about a subject? It seems as if though the student-professor relationship is inevitable. How can this be turned into a different model? Maybe I presume you're going to solve this throughout the rest of the lecture, but just the fact that we're in a lecture kind of begs the question.
Mario, do you think Michelangelo ever attended a lecture?
I have no idea.
I can tell you he didn't. I know him. I'm that old. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know him. The point is, he probably, in fact, we know his history. Vasari has written about him. He never attended a lecture, but he did have people who were experts, the professors who taught him. And you know how it was done? It was called apprenticeship. I'm not saying lectures are bad per se. So stay tuned. We'll come to your question, okay? In other words, experts are good. You learn from experts. Even a great tennis player like Rafael Nadal, right, has a coach, right? It was his uncle, actually. Or Federer, my favorite, has a coach. The coach may not be better sometimes even than like a Federer's or Nadal, well, some of the greatest players ever. Coaching is important. The lecture format of 45 minutes, 90 minutes of dumping information, that is not. That's the point. Okay. What happens in regular lectures is, in our traditional education system, is after 10 minutes, the leprechaun takes a nap, because that's what leprechauns do, right? And we just plow through it, and we try and make the student feel guilty. You can ignore. Actually, this one you should read. It says the mind is not a sheet of paper, but for a professor to write on. It works by self-service, if inspired. That's the way one should look at learning. There's a lot of science there. There are a lot of philosophers, by the way, who've talked about it, right? If you look at Thoreau or Alcott or Emerson, Maria Montessori, she's a hero. We should go back and put statues of her everywhere, because she, without understanding the science, but her instinct was right. She was a hero. Krishnamurti was another one. Some of you may know who he is. So it turns out, if you actually understand how learning works, and you use things like fMRI, there are all these amazing tricks about creating good learning. And I'll come back to Mario's question again in a minute. By the way, if you go for more than 10 minutes, which I'm doing right now, but I did take a break, the student's mind enters a natural state, and the technical term for it, in fact, is mind wandering. And that's we call it mind wandering, but actually what the student's mind is doing is it's connecting the dots, it's integrating the information, it's consolidating the information, doing sense making. So really, you should not lecture for more than 10 minutes. I'll tell you in a second why. I'll show you the results. Here's another one. At the end of 10 minutes, what should you do? What you ought to do is ask the student to think about what they learned in the previous 10 minutes and ask them questions. Because the act of answering those questions, it's a form of testing, but it's a friendly test, not a grading test. It's called formative testing or formative assessment. It forces the brain to look in the short-term memory and actually promotes transfer to long-term memory. So I'll go on and on, but I won't go through all of it. I wrote a book about it, which if you're interested, in fact, there's a link to that in my slides. So here's one little result I want to present to you. It's a complicated graph, but I'll explain it in very simple terms. Ignore the red piece, just look at the green piece, okay? So let's say you show us videos to students, and this is the length of the video. 3 minutes, 3 to 6, 6 to 9, 9 to 12, 12 to longer. This is the length of the video you showed them. This is how much time they actually watched. Here's the crazy thing. If the video goes up to 10 minutes, students will likely watch the whole video. When the video gets longer, not only will they not watch after 9 minutes, they'll actually give up sooner. Why is that? Because of what I just said earlier. The leprechaun gets tired and sits down. And why does the leprechaun get tired and sit down? Because actually the leprechaun, the prefrontal cortex, works with something called the hippocampus to form long-term memories, and that whole system gets tired, and the leprechaun has to go into sense making and consolidation, so he gets tired. Okay, and all our education systems, we actually tempt mind wandering, and then we sort of penalize a student for mind wandering. Here's another one. This is a very complicated graph, but please ignore it for a second, and I'll just explain what I mean by that. The fundamental message here is this. The act of forgetting, let me repeat it. The act of forgetting is central to learning. How strange is that? If you begin to forget something, and I remind you, just as about when you're about to forget it, you will actually learn better. Okay, and this was discovered by someone called Ebbinghaus 100 years ago. And we have repeated this. We've done this experiment on humans for 100 years. We've also done them on things like worms and fruit flies. and snails, and it holds true. So one of the amazing things about learning is you got to learn it, you got to forget it, you'd relearn it, and the second time you learn it, you'll learn it a lot better. Then you forget it, you get rusty, then you relearn it. Third time, you remember it much better. And the reason is it has to do with the way synapses grow in the brain. Okay, here's another one. Again, the graph, just because it's Zoom, it's hard to explain it without waving my hands, but I'll explain this in much simpler terms. You know, when you study architecture, or let's say art, I love art. Let's say you're studying Impressionist art, the Impressionists. And you're looking at, I don't know, Monet versus Seurat, and you're learning about the differences in style between Monet and Seurat. It turns out you're better off studying Monet, Seurat, Monet, Seurat, as opposed to Monet, 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 Seurat, Seurat, Seurat. Yet every book and every lecture is organized along the lines of the lecture or chapter on Monet and the lecture or chapter on Seurat. Trick after trick we ignore in education because we have this fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be educated. Here's another one. This is about curiosity, and then I'm going to skip over a bunch of slides. It turns out that it's a very complicated graph. Again, it's hard to do this on Zoom, so I'll just explain it. One of my colleagues was doing research where they were putting EEGs on students' brains as they were studying to see if they learned at what EEG pattern resulted in good learning. And they found a particular EEG pattern where the learning was very good, but they couldn't explain what it really meant. What is that EEG pattern? There are another group, and this is the group in California. They were able to show what that EEG pattern is. This is Ranganathan group. And the English word for that EEG pattern is curiosity. So it turns out that if you just forget everything and just make the student curious, the brain releases something called dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter. That's, if I make you hungry, your mouth releases saliva. If I make you mentally hungry, which is curious, your brain releases dopamine. And then the student will eat up any knowledge you give to them. Right? Here's another one. It turns out, if you learn something intellectually, you learn it pretty well. But if you learn it intellectually and then work on it with your hands, you learn significantly better, and the learning is more durable. That's actually the one thing that we can do online, right? In person, on the job, hands-on learning. All these tricks we ignore in the classroom today. And this is the book I wrote on this topic. It came out a couple of months ago. But the bottom line is this. If you look at the way we teach today, when we're in person, we do lectures. But lectures are much better done online because you can make them short and you can apply all these other tricks. But we waste the in-person time doing lectures, right? And why? Because we're so exam-based. Testing, product testing, that's really what we want. And all the stuff we should be doing, we sort of don't do when we're in person. And now nature is confiscated in person from us. And during COVID, we're in the worst of all worlds. What we're doing is we're taking that one thing and we're doing it in Zoom, which is even less attractive, If you want, the future of education is you want to take translation, universal genetic code. You want to take lectures and make asynchronous 10-minute videos. This gentleman, his name is Eric Lander. He's one of the two people, he led one of the two teams, he's an MIT professor, who sequenced the human genome. If you're going to learn genetics, his lecture is going to be pretty good. Every classroom across the world need not repeat this lecture. First of all, they're going to violate the 10-minute rule. And second, are they going to be as good as a highly produced content from Eric Lander? And the Zoom lecture is the worst of both worlds. We have neither the charm of being in person, nor do we have the advantages of being short. So the future of education is, what we should do is take lectures, put them online, and many of the tricks I described to you, you can actually do much better online. And that is what, for example, Duolingo or Babbel, they do that. They actually apply a lot of these tricks. Most professors haven't even heard of them. And then when we have the privilege of being back in person together, we should be focusing on context, curiosity, coaching, and that's the answer to your question, Mario, coaching. So the professor is important, but not 30 feet away, speaking to all of you in broadcast mode, but when they coach you and hands-on learning. And this is what some people call the flipped classroom. And this is the future of education. And that's what we've done at MIT over the last 20 years. We first of all took our entire curriculum, put it for free on the world, put it out for free to the world on something called OpenCourseWare. And we've had 500 million visits. Then we created MITx. MITx courses give certificates. And we've given away 250,000 certificates with that. We created a nonprofit called edX with Harvard. And now there are 130 other partners. And edX has crossed 100 million enrollments. So some of you may know edX. I sit on the board of edX as disclosure. And then we're inventing new micro-credentials. Actually, I invented this micro-credentials at MIT, and we're approaching 900 million enrollees. And the point here is we can do some amazing stuff online, but for all the stuff we can do online, the magic happens in person. And so what we're trying to do at MIT is when we're together, and we do this a lot anyway, but this is going to be even more, let's do the stuff you can do online, because you can't compete with the online. The online is actually very good at lectures because students can fast forward, rewind, it's 10 minutes, all those tricks, etc. But universities have to become inside out, not the monastic entities they were. They have to figure out how to become places of action, social impact, technical impact, all the challenges the planet faces. I'll end with this slide. We are generalizing this at MIT, and we call it Agile Continuous Education. So the basic idea is a combination of three things: micro-credentials, so online courses and online micro-credentials; boot camps, 1-week boot camps, where you actually meet people, do the hands-on learning, and then apprenticeships, internships. And this is the new treadmill that we believe working people will maintain their educational fitness on in the future. And that's why we created it. So I'll stop there. Arati, I'll go back to you. And thank you very much. A real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. I think that's, I hope tomorrow students will not start interrupting the class every 10 minutes, but feel free to do that, because that's the idea of bringing experts from other fields to help us evolve, what we're doing here. I think that there are a lot of interesting topics that you're touching there in your talk. And one of that has to do with the idea of discarding the professor as a professor that has a pen, and the student as somebody that has a paper and just receives information. No, this is a kind of a model that describes somebody that has knowledge, and then this somebody is giving the knowledge that he or she has. But then this is very limited, because it's so much. There are so many things that one could learn together, especially when we're working in research, which is a bit what we're doing here at IAAC. When we're working with experimentation, is very limited if we only get to know what the professors or what the faculty knows. No, and one of the things that we are trying to do with our educational program and with our pedagogical model is, as I was saying in my introduction, to try to teach people how to learn, I mean, in a way to find the tools to continue learning, not what to learn, but how to learn. And this, of course, requires, as you were saying, releasing dopamine through curiosity, but it also requires a critical thinking from the student part to understand which information is distorted. No, we are at a moment of false news everywhere. How to recognize their kins and their peers in order to learn together, because collective learning is also something fundamental, not just between faculty and students, but also between students or colleagues from different backgrounds. So I wonder, you know, like how we can prepare or how we can help the ones that they learn to learn in a way that they could avoid distortions and they could somehow create an independency of learning, of continuing learning in their life, even after they go out from university or from the school.
Yeah, that's a great question, Archie. I just wish, you know, that we paid as much attention to learning as we do to sports. So let me explain. You take Barca, the soccer team, right? And you take the coach. And many years ago, I had the pleasure of hosting Barca here in Cambridge, and at that time, Ronaldinho was the star. And just imagine how much science goes into keeping Ronaldinho fit, or in this case, Messi or anyone, right? How much science goes into their training regimen? How much science goes into their diet? And even think about your own personal fitness. I'm sure many of you are careful about your diet. You're careful about how you exercise. You warm up before you exercise. You cool down after you exercise. You stretch. On days you don't exercise, you might do yoga. You might do aerobic. You may do anaerobic. I am a rower. I row, you know, and I do interval training, you know, which is something a lot of people who like to do athletics do. I think Matilda has raised her hand. Okay. So my point is that I wish we did this in education. And I assure you, the science behind that is as obvious, and we can do it. And it involves many things. One, always, if you're curious about something, eat it in small chunks. Two, there's amazing resources on the internet and other places to learn about it. Three, always be friendly to curiosity. Encourage it within yourself. And four, I think this is to Arati's point, you have to develop a truth radar. You really need a truth radar. You need a radar that can distinguish truth from falsehood, and it can be developed. And this is, I think, the skill of the 21st century, because when you go online, there's so much junk out there, and you got to separate it out. By the way, this is not that different from our ancestors, because you know they had to find food, and they had to figure out which fruit was poisonous and which was healthy. You know, you didn't want to drink hemlock by mistake. Yes, you know. So you have to do that, and these are instincts you have to do. So if you're not out on the internet trying to learn something every couple of days, you're not honing that skill. Matilda, I think, had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Sanjay. Thanks very much for the lecture. I'm going to be very honest. I missed the first part, so I didn't have the 10-minute issue, thankfully. But I have two questions that are maybe in some way linked, so I'm going to ask them together. The first one is related to what you were saying about this maximum of 10-minute videos, and also this idea of like forgetting something and then relearning it and then forgetting it and then relearning it. And every time you reprocess the information, I guess you learn it better, or you have a new experience with it. And I was wondering if you have made connections in your research or in your practice, of course, between these kinds of parts of information and the quantity of information that we have like thrown at us or like put in our face some way nowadays. Because I was thinking in a completely different sort of field, you know, music or songs have gotten much shorter now. You know, before there were these really long guitar riffs and stuff like that. And now songs have gotten much shorter. And I guess on one side, that's also a business question, as in if you make lots of short songs, you sell more songs and therefore you have an economic return. But I guess it's also impacted by how much people are like, how much people can actually concentrate on the music to some extent. And so I was wondering if you've ever sort of reflected on this relationship between our sort of attention span and the quantity of information that we have put in front of us and how we process it. And maybe that's also related to this mixed learning form, or I don't know what it's called, but the mixed learning format where you were saying it's better to learn one thing than another, then go back to the first and then the other, rather than doing a block of one thing and then a block of the other. But in reality, what we have is not just one thing and then the other. We have one thing, another thing, another thing, another thing, another thing. So we have a lot of stuff coming at us. And then the second question, which is something that is in some way related to it, but it's a question that I've always had, and maybe you're the right person to give me the answer to, is that now I've seen that in like primary education particularly, students are now working with iPad. My brother has small kids, so they're all working on like digital sort of interfaces now. And so a lot of them don't actually know how to write or don't use writing as we did when we were younger. And I was thinking about this in relationship to the last thing that you were saying, which is that working with your hands makes learning significantly more durable. And I have been reflecting on this for a long time, and I haven't really had an opportunity to have someone give me an answer. But do you think there's a relationship, or there will be a relationship between the fact that a lot of people write less, so maybe they are less manually inclined already from a very young age? Will this have an impact on the future of learning, but maybe on a longer term?
So let me answer the second question first, and I'll answer the first question. The second question, as architects, let me just tell you, you're better off drawing, and I'm sure you're great artists, but drawing a bad picture with your hand than a good picture with a computer. We just know this. You're better off taking handwritten notes than typing notes. We know this for a fact. We also know that actually with an iPad, with an Apple Pencil, which by the way, Steve Jobs shunned, and it only afterwards appeared, you can write. And I have found myself writing more. And I see my 18-year-old daughter, and she writes more as a result. And in answer to your first question, Matilda, and by the way, I have to say, Matilda, I heard so many accents in your voice. I'm completely confused. I thought Australian, I thought French. I can't really tell.
I'm Australian, French, Italian. So you got 2 out of 3. That's pretty good.
Oh my God. Okay, all right. On the attention span thing, clearly our young people have shorter attention spans, right? But we're contributing to it by forcing them to show attention spans that exceed human capability. That's what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting that being distracted is a good thing. And a lot of things I've said, if you take them to the extreme, they encourage distraction. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying asking someone to pay attention to a torrent of information for 40 minutes is idiotic. And actually, you're training them after 10 minutes to do something worse than not learning. You create the illusion of learning. You think you've learned, and it's actually worse. So I think that that's the change we have to make. There is no doubt, however, that there is psychology, there is research that we are creating a highly distracted view of the world. And I do think now, as far as music is concerned, I was listening to, like Old Town Road, right? Lil Nas X. It's such a short song. It's like 2 minutes. And now they're even shorter, right? I was a little shocked when I first heard it. I said, is it done? Where's the guitar riff, right? So I think that, yes, we are moving that direction. Unfortunately, that's being driven by social media, by consumer consumption patterns, etc., right? But hey, listen, you're from Spain. You aren't going to complain about tapas, are you?
Hey, we're not from Spain, but majority of us were not from Spain.
Is that right? Okay. But no one is going to complain about tapas.
And I don't
no
think
one's going to complain about tapas, right? Or dim sum. But no, I think I've sort of answered your question in that respect, yeah? And then there's a question from Sasan Bairami.
Exactly. Sasan, do you want to unmute yourself and
is it possible to
the question directly, please?
Yeah. Okay. I was wondering what is your opinion, because I was doing a course with TraceLink at MIT's Middle. I think 4 years ago we worked on this theory by Seymour Papert. learn by doing, and doing projects, peer, passion, play with 4Ps. I wonder what is the difference between the outcomes of that types of education with the outcomes with the traditional educations that instructors just on the board and or on the digital media just sharing the slides without doing anything, without doing projects, without doing tangible stuff. What are going to be the difference? Is it going? I mean, is it Seymour Papers' approach going to be the future of education, or the EDX and types of MOOC, quote unquote, massive online open courses would be the future of education? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't see a dichotomy there, Sasan. And may I say, I love your name. It's a beautiful Persian name, I think, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So I actually don't think there's a dichotomy at all. I happen to agree 100% with Mitch Resnick and with Seymour Papert and their intellectual sort of ancestor, Piaget, Jean Piaget. And so in my book, I call it inside out versus outside in. So let me tell you, can you teach the multiplication tables entirely by constructivism? You could do some, but it's not that efficient, right? But if you know the multiplication table really well, can you do a more advanced project where you invoke your multiplication tables more efficiently? The answer is yes. So some things are better taught inside out, but you can still make them playful. You can still do projects, right? You can still invoke passion. That's passion actually ties to curiosity, amongst other things. You can still give context with projects, right? But there's an in-between where as much as possible, you want to do constructivism, but there are things you need to learn procedurally, and there you're probably better off going to edX and figuring out how to do the matrix inversion to do, a particular type of machine learning. And then you want to apply it in a project. So it's a bit of both, but I know Mitch very well, obviously, and I believe that perspective 100%. And I think that's what we should aim for. It's just not efficient sometimes to teach the more basic skills that way. And that's why I have, take the MOOC and then do a bootcamp. And our bootcamps are hackathons.
Oh, yeah.
A hackathon where you're working as a team. There's, you're inventing something new, and then do an internship or an apprenticeship where the company gives you a project. So that's you want to blend all three.
So you say what you're saying is they're complement to each other.
That's right.
One way or the other. Okay, thank you.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Aman, do you want to say your question?
Hello.
Yep.
Can you hear me well? Because I'm not sure about my audio. Yeah. So basically, when I was listening to your first few slides, you came about saying about the job shift for some sectors that are being declined at now, such as the retail and stuff, and they are like now job shifting towards the industries of like say Zoom and stuff like that. So I was just wondering, obviously the ones who have been brought up with this education of retail won't be very good with the knowledge based how do I put it? When you shift someone who's always been learning about retail to telecoms, such as, it's obviously going to be hard for that person to, get into that field. So what I was saying is, or rather what I was thinking is, do you think a solution to this would be to teach students right now about everything, about all the industries, which isn't possible? But it could be an outcome for the future to like secure the jobs, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Look, the way I look at it is, imagine that you had a school for soccer players, okay? Then, well, you teach them, foot skills and footwork and things like that. And, but imagine if you had a school for athletes, but you don't know which sport they're going to play and they grow up. You would teach differently. You would teach core strength, cardio, good exercise, muscle conditioning, because you don't know, well, are they going to be a tennis player? Are they going to be a soccer player? Are they going to be something else, right? A basketball player? You don't know.
Yeah.
So we have to prepare students for a life in which the sport they will play is unknown. So more and more we have to focus on core strengths. And one of them is how to take care of your body, right? If you're sports. And in this case, how to take care of your mind and how to learn continuously and be ready and be agile and to be flexible. So I actually don't believe we should teach every student about every job. I do believe we should teach students how to learn a new job, how to continuously upgrade their skills. And that to me is the existential question of education. Otherwise, they'll get the first job. It's a second and third job that'll be the problem, as I said earlier.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Roman, do you want to bring the discussion into the detail of architecture and building? Do you want to say your question? Okay, Roman is basically, Roman, are you there?
Yeah, I can just answer it and say that, yeah, I think the architecture of universities has to change very fundamentally. Nadir Teherani, who was on a panel with me and RT a few weeks ago, in fact, I requested him when he was a professor at MIT before he moved to lead a group looking at the architecture of universities. I was involved actually in designing a university in Singapore. I was I led the MIT team. And we said fewer lecture theaters because of the things I said, more breakout rooms, more project rooms, more places for you to put your projects. You know, here's a crazy thing. You have a project, it's some bulky thing. Where do you lock it up? Are there lockers? Or do you have to take it to your room? You know, just simple things like that. More community spaces, more conference rooms, where small conference rooms. So anyway, these are some of the things I think absolutely it has to change. Our educational institutions are designed for a different world. The world has changed. Right.
Okay. I also think that in a way, I mean, we keep on talking about students and how students learn, but I also think that, you know, if everything changes in the model of education, then the educators are also becoming somehow obsolete the way that they operate today, no? So they also need to update themselves to transform themselves from content providers, let's say, to connection or network providers for the students or for their community. And that requires, especially people that have been teaching like this for many, many years, that requires a radical mental shift, no? How do we reach that, especially in big universities where, you know, like there are more rigid forms of how teaching is happening and for how many years a teacher is staying in the university as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I mean, I think the teacher has to rethink their role as a coach. I come back to Michelangelo. You know, who were Michelangelo's coaches? You want to be like that person. And in fact, there is actually another very interesting piece of work on the science of coaching. The approach to coaching that works is something called deliberate practice, where you give the student a task, you see how they do it, then you give them a coaching to make them better at it. And coming back to the question earlier, Mario's question, teachers have to go from, you know, a person who speaks to a person who coaches, which is doing, hinting, challenging, and making the student better. In fact, there's a book about it that someone else wrote, not me, written by a psychologist by the name of Anders Ericsson, who passed away, unfortunately, a couple of months ago. So this is the book. It's called, can you see it? Peak. So with the science of expertise, I recommend reading it. For those of you who are musicians, you all know about Mozart's perfect pitch, right? And people thought it was God-given. And Mozart was unique. But it turns out in Japan, there's an experiment by coaching. You can, with a high probability, turn at a young age, you can only do it at a young age, give everyone a perfect pitch. That was the breakthrough.
Okay, I see there's a question from Ksama. Do you want to do the question? I don't see it written, and then call.
Yeah. Hello,
Hi.
Sanjay.
Hi, Shama.
Yeah, I looked at the approach that we are developing for the recent changes in the education system that you're proposing, and we should be going forward to. I want to know what is the vision that we're looking at down the line, because if this is the action of change that we're looking at, then what is the bigger picture down the line 10 years that we're looking at? Now we could formalize ourselves being architects, engineers, scientists, and we could enroll ourselves under some names. So after 10 years, you think that these hierarchies will no more exist, or the categories will no more exist? And then how do we deal with the entire fabric of people with multiple educations and multiple skill sets?
Yeah, I mean, I think architects will exist because we'll still build buildings. We'll still need to design things. But the skills of architecture will evolve. Obviously, already there's, a lot more computer design. You probably use Revit and, AutoCAD a lot more. You probably use 3D printing to make models. You probably, are doing a little bit more engineering. There'll be more and more engineering tied to architecture, for example, because of climate change, environmental issues. It won't be just beauty. It'll be compatibility with nature, heat modeling, solar insulation, things like that. There may be other things. Regulations may change. There'll be new technologies, new building materials. There'll be, windows that change color, change, all these things. There'll be IoT. The way in which we do lighting will change. So I think architects as a profession isn't going to go away. What will happen is architecture will change. And that's where one needs to be flexible and continuously upgrading one's skills. There'll be some professions that do go away. We know that, right? I don't think architect is one of them. And there'll be some professions that are born that never existed. 15 years ago, there was no profession called data scientist. Now it's one of the hottest professions.
Okay, that answers it. Thank you.
Nicole, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes.
And ask about evaluation.
Sure. It's something that I've been wondering a lot, because when I was a student, I used to find evaluation kind of very meaningless per se, but since graduation, I get constantly asked, are we getting graded for this, or what is the importance of grading in the end? And it just kind of got me wondering, is it really, like, first of all, of course, the way that we're evaluating or the way that we're validating knowledge currently is constantly, adapting, and it's changing. But do you think that it's actually an important practice to keep motivation up, or is it just, it's a practice that we have to keep to, so we have a sort of, standard accreditation in the end of the process? So, like, in a way, is it really necessary to grade people? Is this something that brings up to the learning, or, well, not really?
Well, I think we do need to grade, but the problem is how we do it, right? So would you grade a cook on an exam, or would you grade them on what they cook? You would grade them on how well they cook, right? In a lot of areas, we don't know how to get them to really cook, right? You can't really have an architect build a building. You can design buildings. That's why project-based evaluation, it's called authentic evaluation. I think that's where we need to go. Evaluation is still important because in the end, someone's going to get the job and someone won't, and you do want to certify. So I don't believe evaluation is going to go away. But I think evaluation right now is very proxy. We have proxies for the stuff, and the proxy becomes the thing we focus on. And we build a whole system around these silly proxies, and we completely miss whether the proxy corresponds to reality, right? So that's got to change. I certainly wouldn't want to fly in a plane flown by a pilot who only passed an exam, or go under the knife of a surgeon who only passed an exam. I want someone who's been evaluated on the job by another surgeon,
Sure, but in the creative field, such as architecture, it's a lot more subjective to grade or to evaluate, because in the end, it's about designing rather than constructing the final building. So I wouldn't want to be in a building that is constructed by somebody without a permit, but I can still value the drawing of a building done by an architect who hasn't been accredited.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that engineering and some of these hardcore fields, hardcore as in, sort of black and white fields, also have a lot of creativity, and they do get judged on that, I mean, this iPhone is an act of engineering. It's a feat of art, right? So, but I think actually, Nicole, your question is sort of a fundamental question. We need to figure out how to evaluate. That's really what it comes down to, I mean, for example, the way we did it in medicine was, the real breakthrough in medicine was we learned to test medicines on something called mouse models. That was the real breakthrough. The mouse model is a mouse bred to behave like a human being for a certain condition, diabetes, Alzheimer's. And they have, it's a huge market. And once you have that mouse, you can test on it. So we've got to figure out how we evaluate. And to your point, some things are a little bit more subjective, right? Some things you can be more objective. But this, to me, I don't know enough about architecture to answer your question, but I think, to me, this is the existential question. I will say we tend to slip into easy proxies, which are quite distant from the reality of what we should be proving when we say someone's learned something. There was a question also, I think, from Paco, are universities that don't adapt this to this in heading towards extinction? I unfortunately believe that many universities are small private universities that depend on tuition. Yes, a lot of universities are protected by the government, by regulation, by signaling value, so they'll survive longer. But I wrote an article about it at the World Economic Forum, which you can see, where I actually think that a lot of schools will die, unfortunately. Back to you, Arti. I didn't mean to take over.
No,
I hope I answered
I think that was an important question, and it's really interesting, the point of view, because adaptation, I mean, is a symbol of intelligence, no? And it's not something that universities or big institutions are used to do, and I think that, like this kind of flexibility for adaptation, it's a value, it's a contemporary value that we need to have at every moment and at every day. I mean, it was clear that in one night, the whole way of teaching has changed. And as you said, billions or 1.6 billion of students went online. So this adaptability, I think it is in a way a value that should incorporate a variety of models, hybrid models, in-person models, online, off-campus, distributed education models where, for example, everybody is connected through Zoom or through other kind of digital platforms, but then there are sites where they could go and they could practice hands-on making through fabrication laboratories or through, like collaborations among institutions. And I'm saying that because I really think that the future also relies on collapsing the idea of, individualism in universities. I really think that we should be leading towards a kind of a more collaborative based model, especially through different countries, but also within different cities, like how we can really share knowledge among us, how we can allow students to have experiences in different places and in different locations according to necessity, so that we can, in a way, also democratize, the accessibility to knowledge and to certain universities.
No, I agree, Malcolm. I think that has to happen. And we're doing that now, right, with Zoom.
Yeah. Okay, I think Mario has, we need to close in a few minutes, so please raise your hands if you have any other question. I see Mario, you started, do you want to close?
Sure, thank you. So taking on the subject of democratizing method spaces and education, I I do have a lot of, well, not a lot, but I have been working some years with a couple of groups here in Puerto Rico who do popular education methodology. They do a lot of work based on Freire's theory and that sort of stuff. And, you know, the places we work is, are, you know, very not academical. They're in communities, they're with people who are definitely not, you know, part of the intellectual elite, and we're part of that. And the big question that I have is, I see a lot of benefits to bottom-up learning and creating knowledge from diverse backgrounds. And how could this sort of model be integrated into today's world? You know? Particularly, you know, with the reality of Zoom and distributed learning that's currently happening.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, it's a good question. I think that the thing about bottom-up learning is you're learning ground reality, literally from the ground, right? I want to tell you, maybe I'll end with this little story. For the last, so I grew up in India, and it's a poor country, as you know, and every now and then someone will visit India from somewhere, you know, Europe, America, and they go to a hut and they see a lady, usually it's a lady, a young lady, cooking on a stove, which is 2 bricks and wood, burning wood to boil water or something. And there's smoke in the room, in the hut. And the first thing they say, just being decent human beings, is, oh my God, this is horrible. You know, the smoke is horrible. So let's develop a stove that doesn't produce smoke. And there have been hundreds of projects to make stoves. And unfortunately, they've all failed. There's actually a study about it from the Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT. And I'll tell you 2 reasons why they failed. One from a student and one from a social worker who made this comment to me. The second comment is a little bit disturbing, actually. This student of ours at MIT said, the reason a lot of these women prefer this stove is because collecting wood is a social activity. And the fact that this is an unpleasant activity actually gives them power. They tell the guys, you can't do it, I can do it. And the social worker said to me, and he was an old guy, and he said, it sort of shook me. He said, listen, that's because the reason the smoke works is because malaria kills faster than smoke inhalation. Okay, I don't know if it's true, but that's what he said to me, right? And the third reason is that if you get this expensive stove and it breaks, who's going to fix it? And a lot of these poor people live in the margins of society, and if there's a riot or flooding, they're the people who have to run. It's easier to just grab your kid and run, not with a stove, and then you very settle, you take 2 bricks and you have another stove. So I think that we have enormous amount to learn from the ground, you know, local climate, local practice, culture, local, you know, construction, soil type, food, you know, beautiful stuff, you know, the music. And we haven't completely figured out how to connect the sort of the, you know, primary knowledge generation, you know, the highfalutin stuff with the reality of life. And so I don't have a good answer to your question, but we have to figure this out, you know.
Thank you, Sanjay. We need to be closing. I just want to say that has been great. Not only that you shared with us your views on you know, like how teaching and how learning should change, but I also think it's great that through your work and through, you know, like your talks and your books and your conversations, you are raising awareness about the topic. I think this is really fundamental. Has been really a lecture that stimulated our curiosity. So our dopamine is really on and high. So Sanjay, thank you for for this talk, and thank you everybody for participating and for your commitment and engagement.
Pleasure. Good to see you, Arati. Take care, everyone. Lovely
See you
to see
too
you all.
again.
Okay.
And yeah, we'll see each other soon. Thank you for your participation.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Gracias.
Sanjay. Thank you, Arati. Thank you
Gracias.
very much.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, all.